Oh, here we are. Okay, we're back again. I was thinking over the break that it's working really well. But this is such a wonderful group that asks such wonderful questions. And even though we're a little slower and we're not getting through as quickly, I was thinking that we could continue to work this way, that as you ask questions, I'm working in a lot of things that I might not have ordinarily said, because you're asking very intelligent questions here. And there was one during the break that I'm going to expand on right now, that if you don't mind, if I treat this as a continuing story, and just where the breaks come, when the time comes to break, and then we just pick up the story as we come back, if that's all right with you, we won't be quite so rigid in following the schedule I originally outlined. And I also wanted to mention that because I'm going to Normandy over spring break, I don't want, not Normandy, I'm going to Norman, Italy over spring break. I want to sort of slow down a bit and stretch England out until we go to spring break, and then when we come back, I'll have pictures of Norman, Italy, which I don't have now. Well, I wish I could bring you all with me. But it's going to be a very fast trip. I only have 10 days to get all these places I have to go. But I'll bring you all my pictures to show you. So that's one part of the trip.
Professor?
Yes.
Before you start the story back up,
yeah?
Last 4 classes we've had, the system here shuts down at 10 exactly, so I just want to let you know that, and I think that's happening down at the other campus too.
Yes,
I think that's what they told me earlier.
I think it does, and sometimes it shuts down at 10 minutes to 10, so I'm going to try to watch the clock so that I stop at that point.
Okay, well, as far as I know, it stops at exactly 10, like every time. So
all right.
Just want to let you know that.
I think Don told me last week, our director told me last week, and I'll try to be aware of that. We certainly don't go much over that. You only miss a few minutes, a couple of minutes. The system quits at 10, right? Yeah, we quit at 10 too. Okay, all right. Well, let's not waste time then. Let's get going. We were talking about the administrative innovations and the role of the justiciars, who these are proto-justiciars at the time of William the Conqueror. And this is a little bit controversial that there were justiciars at the time of William, but it's clear that the Queen and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and sometimes Odo of Bayeux, different people would function as the king's ruler, the justiciars. This is the justiciars. There's a book about the justiciars. There's a book about everything, but the justiciars that it's been claimed that they're an innovation of Henry I's reign, but I think there are indications that William had a sort of proto-justiciar, or a concept of it. The chancery became very important. The Doomsday Survey, we said. The forests. While we were talking during the break, one of the students asked me about the concept of the forests, and of course the New Forest, which is in the area of southern England, sort of in the area of Essex and Sussex, was an innovation of the Normans. Now, the Anglo-Saxons had hunting preserves, but the Normans brought from Normandy a concept of forests that they used for conservation, and it was very consciously applied as conserving the wilderness, conserving hunting areas, not necessarily because they wanted to hunt and have sport, which it used to be thought, but because they conserved their resources very carefully. And I don't want to go into all of the details of that, but I want to tell you that my graduate student, Dolores Wilson, has just finished her master's thesis on the ecology of the Normans, the Norman care of the environment. And it's in the library now if anybody wants to read all the details of how they were very careful to preserve the environment and to preserve renewable resources. They wouldn't let the peasants chop down the whole forest to burn over the winter to keep warm because they wanted the forest and the resources of it. They wanted the food, and they wanted the preservation of trees and preservation of fish ponds and animals of all kinds, and so they husbanded their resources very carefully. And so if you want to read all about it, Dolly's master's thesis is now in the library. Yeah.
Weren't the woods, like the acorns, an important source of food for things like swine?
Yes, but if you let swine go, they'll just gobble up everything and destroy everything in the forest. So that they were very careful about when the lords would allow the peasants to bring their herds of swine into the forest, and it was tightly regulated. There are just so many regulations for how you could treat the forest, and there were actually officers called foresters who would come, and they would watch, and you might have permission to chop down a tree, but they gave you the exact size of the tree you could chop down, and you couldn't have a larger one. And so then the foresters would go in and watch you chop down the tree to make sure you didn't destroy the forest. And it's a very interesting story. I mean, they were practicing preservation of the environment and maintenance of renewable resources. And the same with fishing. You weren't allowed to have fish traps that block the whole river. You had to. They were tightly regulated so that they would preserve the flow of the river and the resources of the river. Yeah.
Do you think she's finding such information in charter information, or
Yes.
are people actually, literary sources actually talk about it sometimes, do you think?
There aren't many literary sources that talk about it, although there are a few, but most of her evidence came from charters that restricted the use of rivers or restricted the use of the forest or regulated what the foresters were supposed to do, the officers of the king. And this was a Norman innovation, and we can kind of trace all of our ecological movement back to the Normans in some ways. I mean, because the forests were kind of like national parks are in our country. So that's a very important point, which I had not put on my list, and so thanks for your question. Okay, there was also a rise of a new aristocracy. A lot of the Anglo-Saxons went to Hungary, which was very far away, but Hungary was linked together through the Scandinavian connections and intermarriage with the Scandinavian world. So they stayed within the Scandinavian world. Interestingly, Hungary was part of the Scandinavian world. There's a quote about some of the kings, the Norman kings, having men raised from the dust, and these were like commoners that they raised to positions of high importance because all their loyalty went to the king. That concept kind of works, except that, in my opinion, and this is only my opinion, I have to write a book on it someday, but I don't think that the aristocracy in Normandy was really gelled and solid at that time, and there was a lot of mobility, and you could rise from a lower position to a higher position, and the king took advantage of this by raising people up to positions of importance, and they owed all of their wealth and position to him, and that made very loyal men. And these were Normans, and also some Flemings and Bretons would also be raised. Did you have a question?
I'm wondering if this is a Viking trait of people being able to, due to their marriage, rise very quickly.
I think it is. I would guess that it is. It would be difficult to prove it, but I see the same thing sort of functioning in Viking society that's functioning in Norman society at this time. And the English nobility had not hardened yet, and it was still quite fluid in the time of the Normans. There were marriages between Normans and English women, and we've already seen one of those, Orderic Vitalis, and so there was intermarriage. There were marriage alliances, especially between the Norman families, and so they were constantly building networks of alliances with the marriages of brothers and sisters, and with other families, and linking everybody together. New inheritance laws started to be formulated. There was a kind of practice of primogeniture, and often this is overstated, that primogeniture, which is the inheritance by the firstborn son, was uniformly practiced in England and Normandy, and it really wasn't. It wasn't. There were divided inheritance, and we see that immediately in the first generation of the conquest. The rule came to be among the Norman families was that the oldest son would inherit the Norman patrimony. The second son would usually inherit the English lands, and the third-born son would often be sent into a monastery to make his career in the church, or he would just be a free knight who would be out there to make his fortune, seeking his fortune. And that is a sort of rule of thumb that what happened to the laws of inheritance, but you see exceptions all over the place, so it's really hard to say that is a hard and fast rule. I mentioned the Council of Barons and the Magnates, which I said could be loosely compared to the Witan, and the King William and all the other Norman kings had a Council of Barons around them, and it functioned in a semi-democratic way, that the king would not do something unless most of the magnates agreed, and he would seek their advice. This is part of the feudal contract, that he would have to seek their advice and their cooperation and their loyalty before he would take any major action. Okay, and here again is one of these charters of William the Conqueror, well, the only one I have right now of William the Conqueror. And here is a map I wanted to show you sort of where Hungary is. It's right over here, and it's tied in with Poland and Russia and all the Scandinavian world, which of course England belonged to before the Norman conquest. And so the Anglo-Saxons stayed roughly within their own world. There were repeated invasions from challengers, and here I have a list of them all. You can load this down from the website, all the lists of the invasions that came from the outside: Eustace of Boulogne and Sven Estridsson and Malcolm of Scotland, and the rebellion of the earls, Earl Waltheof and the other earls. Robert Curthose rebelled in 1077 to 78, and he was exiled for the first time. He was a very rebellious son. He was constantly rebelling, and I didn't bring that description of Robert Curthose I had that was so funny. He was short and fat, and everybody joked about him because he was so short. He was practically a midget. Was he the intended heir for England? Well, I think he was. I think that William had thought about Robert inheriting England, but then Robert rebelled. I mean, when William became King of England, Robert demanded that Normandy be turned over to him, and William said no, essentially. And so he rebelled, and then there was a great battle at Gerberoi in 1079 and 1080 when Robert Curthose actually won. It was only through the intervention of Anselm, who was abbot of Bec at that moment, made King Philip of France switch sides from Robert Curthose to William the Conqueror's side, and this spelled the end of Robert Curthose's rebellion. And he was very ambitious. He was wandering around the world trying to promote promote himself through good marriages. In 1079, Malcolm again invaded the north. In 1085, Canute IV of Denmark and Robert of Flanders prepared to invade, and William the Conqueror actually died fighting off rebellions in Maine when he died. And here are all these rebellions that are coming. Robert Curthose rebelled, let me see what year that was. That was in 1077 to 1078, and then he rebelled again later. I don't have the other second date written down for his second rebellion. He demanded that William give him Normandy and Maine because he had already done homage to the King of France for Normandy and Maine. And he was demanding that William allow him to become Count of Maine and Duke of Normandy, and William refused. And it's kind of to his credit, because when we get to Robert Curthose, we're going to see that he was a fairly incompetent individual. He was not a very good Duke of Normandy, and Maine was lost to him fairly quickly. So he didn't do a good job. Now we're coming to the reform of the church, and I'm hoping we'll get through all this today, but we might not. And again, we have to go back to Normandy to look at the roots of what's going to happen in England. Up to the 1050s, the Norman church was only mildly reformed. We did talk about reformers coming in and the restoration of abbeys, but it was a very low-level kind of reform. Reform really took off with the foundation of the Abbey of Bec in 1034 to 1037. And Erlewin of Bec was the first to convert as a monk of Bec. And this is actually in my book. I don't know if I showed you this, the Abbey of Bec in the Anglo-Norman state. And we have the Life of Erlewin, which I believe is the earliest document that we can really trust at this time. But Erlewin was a knight at the court of Count Gilbert of Brionne, and Count Gilbert was a brother of, I believe it was Richard II. And what Erlewin did was to renounce his homage and to say, I'm no longer going to be your man. And it's kind of complicated story of why he was going to do that, but the story sets him up as a perfect knight who had reached the pinnacle of knighthood, who had accomplished everything that a knight could accomplish. And then it's as if he reached the top and he said, is this all there is? And then he turned to, without really knowing what monasticism was, he turned to the church and to a spiritual kind of life. And he went out in the wilderness without knowing anything at all. He actually talked Count Gilbert into giving him his own lands, not in feudal tenure, but giving them to the church that he wanted to found. And he founded this church, and he makes all kinds of mistakes. He does everything wrong, and he has to learn how to do it right. But you get a real picture of what's going on in Normandy at that time, because what he did was kind of do some research and see, go to the local monasteries and see how people were doing things. And what he found was nothing but corruption, and the monks were having fist fights, and there's one funny one where it says that one of the monks knocked the teeth down the throat of the other one, and they just weren't being very good Christians. And so you get a picture of Normandy being very corrupt, of the Norman church being very corrupt, Erlewin being very pure of heart and almost discovering, almost without any instruction, how to be a good monk. And then and another interesting thing is he founds this new abbey, and then he involves his mother in it. His mother gives her hereditary land, which interestingly he didn't inherit, and she held in her own right. And then she joins the abbey, and she becomes like a servant in the abbey, washing the monks' clothes and cooking their food. And then it's a very poor abbey, but it's having some success when Lanfranc comes along, and he is the lantern of learning in about the 1040s. He's a civil lawyer from Pavia in Italy, and he's not a monk when he joins the Abbey of Bec. He's not a churchman, he's not a monk or a priest, but rather he was a teacher. And he came to Normandy to found a school because he thought Normandy needed a school. And he taught for a while in Avranches, which was far in the west, but he had no success, obviously. He was then captured by thieves and tied to a tree, and he made a vow that if God would rescue him, that he would find the poorest, most miserable abbey in Normandy, and he would join it, and that meant Bec, okay, when God saved him. And Erlewine was just so excited when Lanfranc came along, because he thought, my gosh, what is this? I mean, this very learned scholar has come to be a monk of Bec, and he was absolutely thrilled. And then when you read the story, you think, well, wait a minute, it looks like they're having a kind of battle here. And they kind of were. They were contending with each other because Lanfranc apparently had the Benedictine rule, and Erlewine was ruling very harshly. And Lanfranc didn't approve of him, so he threatened to become a hermit. And Erlewine was so upset that he clearly would do anything to keep Lanfranc there. So what he does is make him prior and second in command. And so the two of them are then ruling the abbey together. Lanfranc immediately opened a school in the abbey, and the story is that students came flocking from all over Northern Europe to study with Lanfranc because he was so famous. And one of the statements that they make here is that the sons of duques joined the abbey, and the sons of duques would be sons of military commanders. These would have to be knights and young men who were training for knights, and so apparently we have the core and the beginning of a learned aristocracy, an educated aristocracy coming out of the Abbey of Bec. And I've written an article about that where I went through all the documents, all the charters, and said, who are the major donors to Bec? And the sons of these men must have been the ones who went to the Abbey of Bec, because it's customary when you place your son in a school or an abbey that you give a grant to that abbey. And so that's where my reasoning was coming from. And this would mean that the men who went with William the Conqueror, the younger ones, would have been educated, and the ones who went to England. And you were asking at the break, who was smart enough to figure out the system that William so cleverly put into being? And I'm wondering if it wasn't these educated young men who came from the Abbey of Bec, because many of them were these people who became sheriffs and who were great magnates of the king. Yeah.
I wonder if Lanfranc, when he went to Canterbury, did he continue to be part of the administration, or is he cut off from the system?
No, he was absolutely part of the administration, and I want to bring that up with what happens. We also have to note that the future Pope Alexander II studied at Bec with Lanfranc, and we know that's clearly true because it's stated in many chronicles. When he meets with Lanfranc later, he reveres him as his teacher, from his former teacher. Yeah.
Is there any records from Bec of who did study with them?
Yes, and they can be tracked down, but most of the ones who are mentioned are churchmen. They become churchmen in other places. They're easy to track. It's the laymen who are hard to track, and the churchmen can be tracked.
So there are no books that link up who studied under Lanfranc, who followed William to England, and who became English aristocracy?
Only the churchmen, not the laymen. Yeah. You can read the letters. Well, here is one of those Norman abbeys that was only partially reformed. Did Lanfranc bring the Benedictine rule? I think he brought the Benedictine rule to Bec. And then at the time of Lanfranc, Bec began to adopt priories like Cormeilles and Préaux and Lessay, daughter houses. Daughter houses were, so Bec was becoming a new order and founding these daughter houses and having branches all over Normandy. Yeah.
They didn't build double monasteries like the English used to.
No, they didn't, but I'll tell you, I'll come to that in a moment, what they do with women. In the 1050s, Lanfranc reformed the Norman church with Duke William, and William put him as if on a watchtower over the whole church. And immediately after that, Archbishop Mogair, who was a brother of William the Conqueror, was deposed, and Maurilius was installed. And Maurilius was a monk who was in the Abbey of Fécamp, but he had originally come from an abbey in northern Italy, and so he was bringing Italian reform. All these Italians are coming into Normandy and bringing church reform. At the same time, at the very same time that happened, Abbot Robert of Saint-Evroul was deposed, and Osborne, prior of Cormeil, was installed, and he was a son of Bec. He had been a monk of Bec, and Cormeil was a daughter house of Bec, and so now he's installed over Saint-Evroul. And Duke William does it with the staff of Maurilius. And so you can see Lanfranc intervening to put well-trained monks as abbots all over Normandy, as well as intervening to see that the bishops are well-trained in Normandy. Yeah.
I thought archbishops couldn't be deposed, so isn't this just as theoretically wrong and like fraud-like as what they did with Stigand over in England?
Yes, it is. It is.
But no one made a big stink over this.
But at this time, the rules were not hard and fast, and so nobody objected at that time. And Lanfranc is one of the ones who made that argument about Stigand. So, that would be an interesting article to write about the deposition of Archbishop Mogair. It's very vague, and we're not sure what happened. Bec also developed what it claimed was a list of unique liberties and customs, and these have to do with the freedom from all lay and episcopal authority. The Abbey of Bec claimed that it could elect its own abbots without the approval of the Duke and without the approval of the local bishop or the archbishop, that it was totally free and independent. And so it fought for those, and it was able to have those. So it was a uniquely free and independent abbey in Normandy. And it was growing by leaps and bounds because a lot of churches wanted to be priories of it because they could be free as well. This is the Abbey of Lessay, which was one of the priories of Bec. And I think the Abbey of Bec, which is gone now, must have looked something like this. This is the east end, and the door, the west end is over here, the west front, and the door is on the side, which is quite unusual. It has a crossing on it, which is typical of Norman architecture. The plan is cross-shaped, and it has a tower at the crossing, and that's typically Norman. Yeah.
Will this have any influence on the founding of the university 100 years later in Paris?
Yes, but that's a huge leap to take. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, here's the interior of Lessay, which is very plain and austere, as Bec would have been. In 1063, Lanfranc became abbot of Caen, because remember that he founded the Abbey of Caen for William the Conqueror and got William the Conqueror to do it. And he latched onto the idea of teaching by example. And of course, this is what the Benedictine rule instructs abbots to do, that their main function is to be a teacher, and that you can teach through words, but teaching by example is far more effective by what you do. And my student Priscilla Watkins has written a book on the foundation of the city of Caen and the two abbeys, and she has tracked Lanfranc's actual procedures there, that he dug these canals and he just gave the whole economy a shot in the arm. He built water mills all over. He bought land everywhere, and mills and artisans. And so this is a really extraordinary record of the founding of a new town, and Lanfranc was behind it all. In 1059, Anselm came to Bec. He was also from Italy. He was a student from Aosta in Italy. They were in the area of Savoy, which is kind of up in the French Alps between Italy and France. And he was an extraordinarily gifted young man, and Lanfranc immediately jumped him ahead of all the other monks and made him prior. After Lanfranc went to Caen, Anselm continued the school of Bec. Now, whereas there were mostly lay students in the time of Lanfranc, now we have mostly students who are monks and become monks. And in my opinion, Anselm was really running the monastery, and Erlewine was just simply a figurehead. I mean, because he really doesn't do anything much in these years. And Anselm does something quite unusual. He installs in Bec a bunch of women, not very many, there were 3 or 4, who he calls the mothers of Bec. And when their husbands retired to the Abbey of Bec, he brings them into the abbey to live along with the monks, and he calls them the mothers of Bec. And they're like nuns. They take the veil, and so he's making an abbey that includes both men and women. And I've written a book that has just come out in the past year. It's called St. Anselm and the Handmaidens of God. And I argue in that book that he admires especially mothers. His ideal woman is a mother and a married woman who takes care of her children. And I argue more than that, but this whole concept of mothers, and this is of course connected to the Virgin Mary, but he accords an equality to women that is very extraordinary, and admiration for women. I think he likes women better than he likes men. He sees them as not only the mothers and the nurturers of their children, but the civilizers of their husbands. He sees their husbands as like barbarians, these wild savages who are out there, and the women are the ones who train them to be good Christians, and so both the husbands and the children. Anselm begins writing theology, prayers, and meditations, and he's most famous for writing that. He's written a lot of prayers and meditations. He is the one who wrote the ontological proof of God, so-called, that he proves God's existence by reason alone. And so he's a great theologian. That's what he's mostly known for. Yeah.
Do we have collected works
of Anselm? Oh, yes. He's been published there are hundreds and hundreds of books on Anselm. There's so many editions of his works that you can get hold of. I brought the collection of his letters. These are the translations of his letters. In fact, this is a picture of Anselm. I'm glad that I brought that so you can see what he looked like. Okay, and this is the translation by Walter Froelich. Here's a woman, interestingly, giving him the book. I don't know who that is. I wonder who that is. Anyway, so he's known more for his theology, and he's known because he took the first step of using reason. Nobody had used reason in theology or any other way since the time of St. Augustine, way back in the 4th century or 5th century AD in the Roman Empire. And what Anselm did was to revitalize the use of reason. He wasn't really the first one, but he was the first great person to do it, the great theologian. And it was very scary because, people who were using reason to prove things instead of the Bible or instead of the Church Fathers, they were being branded heretics. And he was very skillful in putting forward his theories, which are quite interesting and unusual, and he was never declared a heretic, so that's really wonderful. There are 3 volumes of his letters, and here they are in these 3 books. This is volume 3, translated and annotated by Walter Froelich. Anselm became abbot of Bec from 1079 to 1080. And you're right, I need to zoom out, okay? And he continued having daughter houses for Bec, adding to the daughter houses of Bec. Okay, here is Saint Etienne Caen, where Lanfranc went, and we've seen that before. It is absolutely typical of Norman abbeys with these huge towers, and here is it's in a cross shape. You can see the cross here, and here is the tower over the crossing, which is typical Norman architecture. And here, I mainly put this in, is a later image of the Virgin, which all the abbeys of Bec are dedicated to the Virgin. Can you see that? Okay, they're dedicated to the Virgin. This is a 12th century rendering of the Virgin in England. That's delicate. and so this is all the daughter houses and Bec and many of the churches in England are dedicated to the Virgin, and so Anselm really had a fondness for the Virgin Mary. Lanfranc became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, and Stigand, of course, was deposed. Lanfranc at first was reluctant to become Archbishop, but he was commanded by Pope Alexander. And the very first thing that he did, and Alexander was his old student, and so you wonder, whether they talked about whether Lanfranc should be Archbishop of Canterbury or not. And having the Pope appoint him rather than having King William appoint him made a difference. I mean, it gave him a different status. The first thing that Lanfranc did when he got to England was to take an inquest of all English customs. And he questioned witnesses with oral remembrance of how things were done in England. Mostly he looked at Bede, which was a history of the English church, and he looked at the customs of the church as Bede had described them as precedents for what ought to be done in England. He also looked at the whole collection of documents in Canterbury. Unfortunately, the Church of Canterbury had burned down 4 years before he got to be Archbishop, and so some of the documents were missing. But when the time came when he had a big fight with the Archbishop of York, he managed to produce those documents anyway. And so the question now is, where did they, we know they're forgeries, and the question is, who forged them? And we don't know who forged them. But Sir Richard Southern has dated them clearly to Lanfranc's time, but we don't know who forged them.
Spiritual forgeries.
Spiritual forgeries, yes.
No, they're not forgeries, they're improvements.
Well, no, they're not just improvements. They're clear forgeries because the original documents burned up in the fire. But the reasoning is that they did exist and they ought to exist, and so someone made them exist in reality. I mean, they used to be there, and they're real documents.
Kind of like if there's not a law against it or a law saying that it can be, then there should be.
But the problem is that there were experts on documents. By this time, the written culture had grown sophisticated enough so that when they were taken to Rome, there were people who could recognize that they were forgeries. So, I mean, these are not dumb people. And they could, unless if forgeries are buried in the books of a monastery for hundreds of years, they're much harder to recognize as forgeries than if you take them to court and try to prove your case with them. Yeah, comment in the back. No, you. Yeah. Uh-huh. Your name is Robert, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
What he may have done was simply to consult with as many of the English as possible and find out what had been in the missing documents, and then undertook to recreate them from the memory, because they have that in a great many documents over there when they say, from the time when the memory of man runneth not to the contrary.
Yeah.
So it may have been that.
He could have done that, and there was not a clear concept of what forgery was at that time, not nearly as clear as it is nowadays, so that makes a difference. Yeah, did you have a comment?
I was wondering if this idea of forgeries and looking into these documents is it a little bit later, or does it happen in the
No,
Reformation times?
No, they recognized them in his own time. They were recognized as forgeries in Lanfranc's lifetime. And so the question is, who did it? Well, I think it fits in with Lanfranc's legal mentality, and again, remember, he was a lawyer in Pavia, and the first thing he did was to prove legally at court what all the rights of Canterbury were. And one of the things he says is that the Archbishop of Canterbury is primate of all Britain, and that means not just England, but also Scotland and Ireland and the Orkney Islands. And so what he's doing is looking at the past, what happened under Canute. Remember that under Canute, the archbishops of Canterbury were exerting their influence over these people. And so he is then taking these past events and saying, once this happens, that's it. Canterbury is head of it forever. And that Canterbury should be the head of the whole British Isles. And in the sources, what it says is he's Archbishop of the other world. And it's almost like the Scandinavian world, not Scandinavian, but English world. It's an English island that is separate from the continent. He's Pope of another world, some of them say. And this is interesting. This is quite an extraordinary concept. Yeah.
I'm wondering, this is foundational to the later rise of the Pope from Rome.
Oh, yes. Well, it's, of course, the popes fight it desperately, and with Gregory VII being there, you can see how Lanfranc and Gregory VII would clash on this issue, because Gregory VII would think that he should dictate to the English Church, and Lanfranc would think that he is the Pope of another world, that he is the head of all Britain. He's the primate of all Britain. And so we've got philosophical institutions or concepts of institutions that are clashing. They're competing ideas of what the papacy ought to be. And Lanfranc is coming from that early Reform background, the moderate Reform, where primates in the various areas have a lot of power, and the Pope is a place where you go to get authoritative information, but you don't obey everything the Pope does. It's more of a decentralized system that he envisions, with the primates being in control in each of the countries that they're in. And Gregory has a much more authoritarian concept of how things ought to be done. And so they come into quite a fight. And Pope Alexander II clearly agrees with Lanfranc, and he's going along with Lanfranc and agreeing with them. Because the first time this is tested is in the Canterbury-York controversy, because at the very same time that Lanfranc was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Bayeux was actually appointed Archbishop of York, and because the Archbishop of York had died. And Thomas was a Bec monk, and here we have Lanfranc searching all the records to find out the rights of Canterbury. Well, Thomas was trained at Bec, so the first thing he did was search all the records to find the rights of York. And the records are contradictory. It's not clear which one of them should be the superior, and the sources are the letters of Pope Gregory the Great from the time of the foundation of the English Church, and the rights are not clear. And so what Lanfranc does is just run all over Thomas. I mean, he really defeated Thomas with his evidence. Lanfranc went to Rome, and when Pope Alexander heard the evidence, he turned the case over to William, and he said to William, this should rightfully be judged in your court. So Lanfranc went back, and he marshaled all his evidence. He had piles of evidence he brought into the court, and then he describes it, and he said, Thomas has only this little bit of evidence, just this one letter from Pope Gregory, whereas we have reams and reams of letters and bead and evidence for our case. And so Thomas is defeated. The King's Court rules against him, and he has to swear a profession of obedience to Lanfranc, but he fights to the bitter end. I mean, he won't do it for his successors. He'll only do it for himself, and he argued that the case had to be proved for his successors. And so, but they're both monks of Bec, and that's kind of the Bec training.
So Bec created monsters?
Well, in a way, yeah, but it's quite interesting what they do. So here, I've already gone through this. Lanfranc won the case, and Thomas had to swear obedience. Lanfranc did have other evidence. He had written professions of obedience from a lot of the different bishops of England that had been made to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Well, the first thing Lanfranc did was to reform all the monasteries of England, and he wrote a book called The Monastic Constitutions. And what it was a new kind of rule for the monasteries to be ruled by. He didn't force it on all the monasteries, and it wasn't just the Bec tradition. It was a kind of collection of different good customs on the continent. But if you go back to Bede and you see the instructions that Bede gave to St. Augustine in founding the English Church, this is what Bede said. This is what Bede said, that Pope Gregory told St. Augustine, gather all the good customs of northern France and England and select the best ones and make a collection of them. And this is what Lanfranc did. And you know the extraordinary thing, and he set out to reform all the monasteries of England. What he did, he reformed the monasteries first. He gradually got rid of all the Anglo-Saxon abbots because the rule is they have to die off. But as soon as they died, he put Bec monks and Caen monks in. And so by the time Anselm died, and Anselm became Archbishop of Canterbury after Lanfranc, by the time Anselm died in 1109, all the monasteries in England had abbots from Bec or Caen, or from one of their daughter houses. And so he replaced all the Anglo-Saxon abbots with Bec or Caen monks. And Caen considered itself a daughter house of Bec. They all went into this mode of Bec reform where they recovered all the lands that had been attached to the monasteries that they thought belonged to them and had been wrongfully taken, and they recovered land. So this is part of the reform process, is to recover the lands and to build everywhere. And what the Normans did all over England was to tear down all the Anglo-Saxon church. There are hardly any Anglo-Saxon churches left. And all over England, there are hundreds and hundreds of churches that the Normans built. And everywhere you go in England, there's a Norman church.
Professor?
Yes, I can barely hear you.
I would imagine with all the English church or clergy being deposed, they would be in favor of the rebellions.
No,
is
they
there
weren't
any
deposed.
talk of?
I'm sorry, they weren't deposed. He waited for them to die. Okay?
Right, but all the original English guys, I mean, there must have been a lot of younger monks or something. Was there any sign of jealousy on their part?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Yes, the monasteries in England were filled with English monks, and there were violent rebellions. And there were some rebellions where the monks were so mad because the new Norman abbots brought French and Norman practices in and throughout the English customs, and they rebelled, and sometimes they killed their abbots. I mean, they threw them out violently, and they got rid of them. And there was a lot of violence in the monasteries. You're absolutely right, but they did not depose them because that would have been against canon law. They waited for the old abbots to die, and then they put Norman abbots in. Yeah, and they were all from Bec and Caen. Yeah, did you have a question?
I was just going to say that the monks are used to fighting a lot. I mean, in the early days, it seems like.
Yes. Well, they're pretty strident in their religion. Yeah. And so there are hierarchies of bishops. The Archbishop of Canterbury is supposed to have all the bishops of England under his control. He had a particular suffragan bishop. The Bishop of Rochester was his chief lieutenant, and there were a couple of different ones, but Gundulf was the most important one, who became very important. And all the bishops of England wrote oaths of obedience. They were actually written oaths that still exist to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And can you see how the oath of obedience that a bishop writes to the Archbishop is kind of like the oath of fealty that a knight gives to his lord? It's the same kind of concept. They also went around and restored a bunch of English saints, and this is very, very curious. There was one man already in England, that was Goscelin of Saint Bertin, and Saint Bertin was an abbey in Flanders, actually in Boulogne. Well, no, it was in Flanders or Boulogne, and Goscelin of Saint Bertin had been in England with the people around King Edward. And he stayed there for many, many years. After the Norman conquest, he was a scholar, and he went out researching on a research tour all over England to all the nunneries of England. And he wrote saints' lives of all the famous English saints, women saints, going back hundreds of years. And these were all collected. And this is only one example of what the Normans were doing. All the saints' lives, the great saints of England, all their lives were rewritten by the Normans. And what they did was to rewrite history. You know, the victors write the history. And so when you go back and you read all of these saints' lives, you read the old version by Bede or St. Dunstan or St. Oswald from the old Anglo-Saxon times, and then you go back and read the Norman revisionary saints' lives, and what they've done is instilled in these saints all the virtues and the program from Beck. They've rewritten their lives so they conform to the Beck ideal. This is quite extraordinary. I mean, it's just almost unbelievable as it goes on. And we can see this process again in the letters of St. Anselm, because when Lanfranc goes to Canterbury, Anselm is still back at Bec running the school of Bec. And so then Anselm sends a whole bunch of Bec monks to Canterbury to join the Canterbury monks and teach them the right way of doing things. And at the very same time, Lanfranc sends a bunch of Canterbury monks to Bec to study under Anselm and how to be a good Bec monk. And this one particular guy, Osborne of Canterbury, goes and he learns from Anselm how important the writing of history is. And Anselm writes letters back to Lanfranc and says, well, I need information about St. Dunstan, and I need information about St. Osborne, and I need the information about, you know, St. Elphege. And so Lanfranc sends it back, and then Osborne studies, and then he goes back to Canterbury, and he ends up writing saints' lives at Canterbury of all these famous English saints that now their lives are going to be rewritten. But he was trained at Bec. And so this back and forth across the channel is going on. Here is St. Gregory the Great, who is seen as the founder of the English Church, and he's seen as the apostle to the English, and the Normans latch on to him, and they see him as their founder as well.
As you say, could the religion that flows back and forth across the channel be another aspect of the cross-channel empire?
Yes, it could. It could, because certainly the Bec monks and the Abbey of Bec and the rule of Bec and all these ideals that are flowing from Normandy to England, and they take over the English church. I mean, the Bec ideals take over the English church. And here is St. Gregory. They see him as the apostle to the English, and the Normans see themselves, and this is so extraordinary, I could hardly believe it when I first realized this, that Lanfranc and Anselm see themselves as reenacting the conversion of England. They see themselves as St. Augustine and all his other monks reincarnated, and that they're coming and they're reenacting this whole performance of converting England again. And they write in their letters and they talk about, oh, these English barbarians, they just don't know how to do things right, and they're doing everything wrong, and they're not in touch with Rome, and they don't know the right way, and we have to come and reform them. But in actuality, I mean, there was nothing wrong with the English way of doing things, and it was certainly not unchristian, but this is how they saw themselves, as reenacting the conversion of England. And that just blew my mind when I realized that. I mean, such a strange way of thinking about what they're, how the world works, you know, how the world works.
There's a grandiose about them, it seems.
Like, I mean, the history writing also shows that.
Yes.
And they seem to see England as the place where they really reenact, or I mean, there seems to be continuity too. They look to Bede and Augustine,
yes,
and so there's always the England seems to have that place of importance in ancient times, and then now they are back to make it really right.
Yeah, and they see themselves as God guiding them to re-reform the English church. I mean, they've already done it to Normandy, and now they're going to revitalize the English church. This is St. Dunstan. Here is St. Dunstan, and this is one of those lives that they wrote. They're rewriting the life of St. Dunstan to make him conform to the Beck ideal.
Call it a Renaissance.
You could, in a way, and this is all scenes from the life of St. Dunstan. If you can see the various things of his life, he goes on a boat trip and he's sick for a while, or he heals the sick or something like that. And here he is writing, and here he is as a bishop. And so they rewrite the lives of the English saints. Eadmer of Canterbury also goes to Beck to study, and Anselm, in fact, called him Beck's student and considered him a monk of Beck. And he just wrote profusely. He wrote the life of St. Anselm, the life of St. Dunstan, the life of St. Oswald, and then he wrote this important book, the Historia Novorum in Anglia. And this is Norman history as propaganda. It is all from the Norman point of view, but it's English history from the Norman point of view. And Eadmer is buying into that. He's an Englishman by birth, but he's buying into this Beck point of view. And that's why all of these versions of the conquest are so contradictory, because so many people are writing from these different points of view. Herman of Lotharingia was the bishop of Wiltshire, and previously he had been bishop of Sherborne and Ramsey, and he was also from the Abbey of St. Bertin, and so he had sponsored Goscelin of St. Bertin to come. Wulfstan, bishop of Worcester, was a leftover from the English bishops. He was the only English bishop to survive, but when you read the life of St. Wulfstan and you read what he wrote, you see that he bought into the Norman Beck plan of reform, and he conformed to it very nicely. Alexander II was Lanfranc's student, and Gregory VII wrote letters to Lanfranc asking for the homage and fealty from King William. And Lanfranc, of course, said, well, we never saw that William's predecessors did homage to your predecessors, and so we are going to follow the customs of England and of the past. And so he makes a big deal about following the customs of England. To the Normans, custom was law. And so they're constantly talking about it in Anselm's letters and Lanfranc's letters. They're leading a legal revival in England, and some people have argued that Lanfranc is really the founder of the English common law, because he was so obsessed with law and he was such a good lawyer, and to him custom was law. And Anselm would say things like, if my predecessor does something, I have to do exactly what he did, and I have to be so careful of what I do, because if I do something, it will set a precedent, and that will bind all my successors forever. So every action that he took, every deed that he did, every word that he said, he saw as making law for those who would come after him. Isn't that an interesting concept?
This is a reversal from the Anglo-Saxons, who seem to have a much better historical consciousness of real things and their evolution.
Yes, I think they do have a more of a sense of reality than the Normans did. I mean, I really, sometimes some of the things Anselm and Lanfranc say, I mean, I'm just so astonished by them. But when you read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you think the Anglo-Saxons have much more of a grip on reality. The Normans are very idealistic about what they're doing. As far as Lanfranc and the king setting patterns for those who would come after him, he's justiciar in the king's absence. That means that when the king is gone, he rules like the King of England. And here is St. Dunstan again. And here is an example of the miracles of St. Edmund. St. Edmund is another English saint who they're rewriting his life to conform to Norman practices. Here is a Bible from the Abbey of St. Edmunds, at Bury. He sees himself as the king's chief advisor. He sees himself as almost a co-ruler with the king, that the king and the Archbishop of Canterbury rule like two oxen drawing the plow through England, as Anselm expressed it later. But it's clear that Lanfranc already had that idea, that he and the king are the co-rulers, and he is the chief advisor to the king, and that image is in Bede. You see it in Bede's history, that's the image that he is to follow. And that he and the king draw the plow of the church through England together. Lanfranc may well have been behind the writing of Domesday Book. And when William the Conqueror died in 1087, a lot of people have argued that it was Lanfranc who actually chose William Rufus, the king's son, to be the King of England rather than Robert Curthose. He is the second son. William Rufus is the second son. Robert was Duke of Normandy, and Henry, the third son, who is called Beauclerc because he was educated, he gets a large sum of money. But William Rufus was a very contrary king, and we'll talk at some length about him later. And Lanfranc had a lot of problems with him because Rufus wanted to go off and do his own thing and not do what his father did, not do what Lanfranc had wanted him to do, and not listen to Lanfranc as his chief advisor. So what happened was Rufus got himself into trouble because Robert Curthose immediately attacked to try to get England for himself, and Rufus had a lot of rebels on his hands to fight with. And Lanfranc saved him by getting him to swear that he would obey the laws of England and obey the laws of his predecessors and protect the church. And so Lanfranc really saved him and got him on course to be King of England and saved him from the rebellion. But then Lanfranc died in 1089, and the minute Lanfranc died, Rufus was just out of control. There was no one to see him anymore. He started confiscating church lands, and every time bishops and abbots died, well, he just kept the abbacies, the vacancies open. I mean, he didn't appoint new or have elected new abbots and bishops. And worst of all, he refused to fill the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which remained vacant for 4 long years. And here we can see, here is Canterbury, here is Rochester, which is where the chief lieutenant is. Wait, this is Rochester, this is Canterbury, this is London here, so we can see where they are. Anselm then became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093 only because he absolutely forced William Rufus to appoint him as archbishop. And what happened was he launched this kind of propaganda campaign where everybody was really agitating against Rufus, then saying that you have to appoint him, you have to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury, and it has to be Anselm. I mean, they were clamoring for Anselm. And what happened was Rufus fell sick, and on his sickbed, and he nearly died, and that's when he appointed Anselm archbishop, because he thought God was going to kill him because he left Canterbury vacant. He appointed Anselm, and then it was all trouble from that moment on. I mean, Ida of Boulogne, I mentioned Ida of Boulogne here. She is a very interesting woman. She was the second wife of Count Eustace of Boulogne, who died shortly after Ida married him. And as a young widow, well, she had 3 children first, but as a young widow, she, I think, and I have argued, that she was Anselm's ideal woman. She was an ideal mother. She raised her children with her own hands. She didn't have any nursemaids around, but she raised them herself and carefully nurtured them. And they turned out to be 3 very extraordinary children, young men. And she was Anselm's very best friend. She's the only person in his correspondence that he wrote to his entire life, and wrote to her repeatedly and visited her. We can track her down in the chronicles when he visited her in Boulogne. He confided in her that he was working hard to win the Archbishopric of Canterbury, but once he got to be Archbishop, he objected. You are yoking an old sheep to a wild bull. Okay, this is his kind of 2 oxen metaphor. And instead of 2 oxen drawing the plow, like the strong oxen, William the Conqueror and Lanfranc, now you have an old sheep, Anselm, and a wild bull, William Rufus. And so William Rufus had all kinds of trouble with Anselm, and there's this very vivid trial at the Council of Rockingham when once William Rufus recovered from his illness, he tried very hard to depose Anselm. Once he found out he could not control Anselm, and Anselm wouldn't just pay him money, and Anselm wouldn't do what he wanted, and so he tried to depose him by writing to the Reformed popes, and by now there was a different pope. Gregory had died, and there was, let's see, who was pope at that time? It was Urban. And Urban was very shaky on the papal throne, and so what he did was make a deal with William Rufus that Urban would send the pallium with his papal legates to England, and it would be Rufus who could confer the pallium on Anselm. Now, symbolically, the pallium is a stole that the bishop puts around his neck that is the symbol of his primatial authority. It's a symbol of his right to rule as primate. And remember that the Archbishop of Canterbury is the primate of all England. So if William Rufus, the king, has the right to bestow the pallium on whomever he chooses, he's not an equal. He's not an equal with the Archbishop, like 2 oxen pulling the plow, but rather he's a superior. Anselm refused this, and he ended up manipulating people so that he ended up winning the right to take the pallium off of the sacred altar of Canterbury as if from the hand of St. Peter. These wonderful political stories, they're in the Historia Novorum, in Eadmer's story of all of this gaining of power and the fight between William Rufus and Anselm. They're very vivid stories and wonderful. 2 shrewd politicians fighting to outwit each other, and Anselm usually wins. It's quite, but Rufus won for a while. I mean, there were some problems. Anselm warned William Rufus to be a good king and tried to make him be a good king. There is some evidence to suggest that Rufus attempted to marry Matilda of Scotland, the daughter of Margaret and Malcolm of Scotland. And I've argued in my book that Rufus really wanted to marry her. In the Chronicles, he's described as attempting to rape her, but that's a very biased thing to say. I mean, I think it's the bias of the author that he really, it would have made sense for him to marry her because she was the daughter of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, and she was the only remaining daughter from that line. So it would have been very sensible for Rufus to marry her, and she was the obvious candidate for queen. Yeah.
He was trying to unite Britain and create a larger Britain?
Yes, I think he was, because later, when Henry I became king, lo and behold, who did he marry? Matilda of Scotland. And Anselm manipulated that marriage. I think Anselm really was a good supporter of Rufus and was trying to help him be a good king. In the sources, though, there is a large accusation of William Rufus being a homosexual, and Anselm is Eadmer is the one who labels him as a homosexual and a Jew lover and a crazy man Eadmer was the monk of Canterbury who had gone to Bec to study under Anselm, and later he became Anselm's secretary as Archbishop of Canterbury. And then he wrote this just huge amount of books later on.
He was the official propagandist.
Yes, he was, and he painted this really black picture of William Rufus as the worst king that England ever had. And you know, the extraordinary thing is that everybody has believed it up to the present day. I mean, they've believed all these scurrilous accusations that Eadmer leveled against William Rufus. And our T.A. Joni is going to be working on Rufus as part of her dissertation. Emma Mason in England is also trying to restore the reputation of William Rufus. Right now, he's considered one of England's worst kings, and even he's been accused of being a witch, he's been accused of being an atheist, and all of these are because of the accusations of Eadmer. And he died under extraordinary circumstances. There's one article by Warren Hollister called "The Strange Death of William Rufus." He died in the New Forest. He was shot in a hunting accident by an arrow. And there's a huge hullabaloo, and so was it an accident or was he murdered? And if he was murdered, who murdered him? Who murdered William Rufus? It used to be always thought that the only person who had anything to gain by murdering William Rufus was Henry I, who became king after William Rufus died. Well, there were other people who had things to gain, and one of them was Anselm. And I actually wrote an article suggesting that Anselm could have been behind the murder of William Rufus. So I'll leave you with that strange thought. And we'll take up the story again next week. Okay.
The rise of the